Okay, good morning. It's still morning. Jason, I just tagged you in Facebook. You're my roadshow traveling companion. Quite honestly, I'm very privileged to work with Jason on numerous projects, Satellite Beach, and work that we're doing in the Keys. And I will tell you, he's very well regarded by the local governments that I work with and that he works with in terms of science and telling it like it is. So it is truly a privilege to work with him. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I was asked to speak about the legal and legislative front. And so I am going to get into some cases because I am a lawyer and I am a planner, but I try to make them interesting and fun at the same time. So I am a new mom. And I have decided that I'm going to, thank you. I've decided I'm going to start my presentations with a picture of my baby Sloan for two reasons. One, if there are any deniers or anybody in the audience that wants to yell at me, it's really hard to yell at me when you start off looking at a picture like this. And secondly, it keeps me grounded as to why I'm doing this work. I have my own practice. I have one other attorney that works with me. We are a small firm. And we work throughout Florida, and mainly our clients are local governments. We do actually have some developer clients, and I'll talk a little bit about those developer clients that we work with. We're very choosy with the developer clients that we work with, and I've had more calls recently from developers asking me to help them factor sea level rise and due diligence into their land buying and their land development strategies, which is good news. So this was back in my partying days when, before Sloan, I was out in Ybor City one night and I saw this picture and I thought this picture was really funny. And I had 2 or 3 beers, so it was really funny. But the point was that, you know, we all like to talk about climate change and we're kind of in that genre, but, you know, what do we really mean? And everything is not what it seems to be. So I'm going to talk about some of the regulations, cases, policies. I'm going to give examples of other local governments throughout the state and what their approaches are. What are we required to start doing? That's a call that I get a lot. I get the calls that are the floor, and then occasionally I get the calls, what are the ceiling? How far can I go with this stuff without subjecting myself to some level of liability or a lawsuit? I see Ralph is in the audience there, so, you know, those are the calls that I'm trying to avoid Ralph showing up in my local government. And then I'm going to talk about some of the new cases that are out there regarding the public trust doctrine and youth plaintiffs all over the country. Again, kind of keeping with this theme of why we're doing this for future generations. So we've been at the climate game for a long time, and I try to put this slide out there to kind of give some of the context that the United Nations has been trying to put agreements in place to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and lower emissions in light of the fact that we know that they are inextricably linked to what is happening in terms of global warming and sea level rise. The most recent agreement, the Paris Agreement, our current administration has signaled that they are interested in either renegotiating that agreement or coming out of that agreement. But there is a time frame with which that can occur, so that's not something that can happen immediately. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how this plays out in the next 2 years when that time frame does creep up on us. And why is it important to understand that international context? Well, it influences our national priorities. And we have been talking about climate change. Some of the first history of congressional debates related to climate science stem back to 1965 in the Johnson administration. So it's not like this just appeared. We've known about it and we've been talking about it a long, long time. But in terms of local governments, many local governments are adopting their own policy approaches to dealing with greenhouse gas management. And there is a movement of local governments across the country called We Are Still In. And the point is that those local governments have committed to still uphold the greenhouse gas reduction targets of the Paris Climate Agreement. So a lot of times what I see is a local government will call me and say, we're going to adopt the Paris climate targets. Is that a good idea? And my response is, well, maybe you should do a greenhouse gas inventory and figure out if they're achievable. Like, that would be a first step, kind of with Jason's theme, data is a good thing. So it's just important to know when you're advocating to a local government or your local government is considering some of these things that they aren't haphazard. There's actual underlying data that is based on that. And then, God forbid, should you not meet your targets, then Ralph shows up at your front door saying, hey, you put this in your comp plan and you're not adhering to it. So it's important to understand what some of these approaches mean. So the law of climate change, it's not like a defined subset or specific separate set of law. What you do is you find it in Endangered Species Act cases or NEPA evaluation or Clean Water Act cases, and I'm going to get into some of that, but there's definitely been some interesting case law that has evolved with regard to nuisance and money damages. I've been watching this database out of Colombia for several years now, and they are tracking all of the climate change regulation and litigation going on across the United States, and it's really interesting. They do a very good job of breaking down the cases into things like renewable energy or coal-fired plant or pipeline or greenhouse gas emissions or NEPA cases. And so if you're interested in this area of the law or you're a recovering lawyer, whatever it may be, this is actually an interesting database to watch, and they break them down with charts, and they're very quantitative about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the money damages case and Protect Our Future cases and what's going on with state law. But there are other evolving legal aspects that have implications for climate change. National flood insurance reform, probably pretty much a household word at this point in terms of congressional debate. It's unclear as to whether we will keep having Band-Aid approaches to NFIP extension or reform, or whether we're going to get in there and wholesale really recreate the program and make it more workable. The community rating system is an incentive-based system that local governments can pass. The better they do with their floodplain regulations, the lower their score, which is better, meaning that flood insurance premiums get reduced in the community. The Corps of Engineers for civil works projects is required to run low, medium, and high sea level rise scenarios in terms of projects where their money is attached to it. A lot of people say, the federal government, they're not doing anything, they're not out planning. Well, if it's a civil works project, if it's a major project, they are required to. NEPA and Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, I'm going to touch on. There were actually some interesting rulings this week with regard to NEPA. In the late Obama administration, there was a rule promulgated to implement NEPA related to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions that requires NEPA analysis to address these topics. Earlier in the Trump administration, that executive order and that rulemaking was suspended. But the interesting thing is that can't change the fact that there are cases out there that still require a hard look at major federal impacts when a project has to undergo a NEPA process. So regardless of the implementing rule, which quite frankly probably would have clarified how to do that analysis, there's still case law out there that requires it. And there were some recent rulings, I think, on a big pipeline case this week or a fossil fuel plant this week that kind of upheld, yeah, you got to look at this stuff when you're undertaking NEPA. Federal Flood Risk Management Standard was an executive order that had been put in place pre-Obama administration and had been extended through that administration. It too was suspended in the early days of the Trump administration, but interestingly, the HUD and other agencies that are doling out disaster relief money post-hurricane are requiring rebuilding to the same standards that were in the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard anyway. So the important thing is that we as taxpayers should not pay in through our federal taxes to a pool that's going to dole out money to rebuild things the same exact way before the storm. Let's build it to a higher standard, and that is playing out in terms of its relationship to disaster relief. So while there have been rollbacks with some of the more administrative aspects of NEPA and the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, you still have federal agencies that are upholding those concepts of considering climate change and sea level rise in their policy implementation. So basic legal concepts regarding government action, and these are kind of important to go through as I'm starting to go through some of these cases. And one thing that's interesting is we, as a group, Jason, Thomas Rupert, and a couple of us have been working on a Southeast Regional NOAA grant the last couple of years, and tying together some of the science and some of the legal and policy aspects of this is we just published some findings regarding research across 4 states, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, regarding road responsibility. And you can put any form of infrastructure in there, road, stormwater, wastewater, water, whatever you want. And the issue is, does a local government have to upgrade infrastructure to keep up with the impacts of climate change? And the answer is probably not, but you have to maintain your existing infrastructure to the standard that it was originally designed. And think about that in the context of a canal. The Corps of Engineers, they build a canal, they let sediment accrue in the canal. The canal does not function any longer with which it was originally permitted and designed. You know, we are exacerbating things with sea level rise, but that infrastructure really can no longer perform. So who's liable? And are we required, do citizens have standing to be able to come in and sue their local government to keep up with Mother Nature and sea level rise? And again, the answer is probably not, but there's no direct case on this yet. All we can do is look at what I would call poster child cases with regard to flooding, and that kind of tells us some of the answer. So what does it mean when a government plans versus how they operate infrastructure? For instance, local government has total discretion as to whether or not to put in a stoplight at a certain intersection or a stop sign and decide what that traffic calming or traffic management device is. Yet they do have a duty to maintain or make sure that it's properly functioning. So once it's there, the decision to put it there or not is not something that somebody can force that decision upon the local government. But if it's not functioning properly, or a stormwater pump, there is potentially a cause of action. And once you build it, you've got to maintain it with reasonable care. So that's another issue. If a local government does choose to upgrade infrastructure, they're going to have to maintain it to that higher standard that they built it to. Lastly, can local governments be held liable for building infrastructure? Well, they can't be held liable for the decision on whether or not to build it, but they can be liable for not maintaining it properly. So with those concepts in mind, we're going to kind of move into some of the cases. The last case, I'm not going to talk specifically about this, but in the context of takings, there's at least one state case that has held government failing to act, sticking your head in the sand and saying, I'm not going to act on this stuff, can give rise right now in Florida law to potentially a taking scenario where access on a particular road was cut off. So doing nothing is not necessarily a legally defensible response either, interestingly. So we're going to talk a little bit about tort cases and what that means in the context of climate change. There's a line of cases post-Hurricane Katrina. Originally, in this line of cases, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was sued for failure to maintain what they call the Mr. Go, the Mississippi Gulf River Outlet Project. And Mr. Go is essentially a combination of canal maintenance and the federal levee system surrounding New Orleans. Ultimately, in this first line of cases, the question was whether or not the method of dredging and maintenance of that canal system and levee system could have resulted in the Corps being liable for the failures of that infrastructure during Hurricane Katrina. Ultimately, that case was appealed. with an initial ruling that the Corps was liable, but under this exemption called the discretionary function exception, the United States can't be held liable for that type of decision in terms of maintenance or failing to maintain that particular type of infrastructure. Now, the interesting thing is, this is just a quick schematic. There's the levee system. Here are the canals that the Corps was responsible for maintaining, and the storm just kind of came in and overwhelmed that infrastructure entirely. So it's the canal and the levee system that they were in charge of building and maintaining. The case was refiled by the property owners as a takings case. And what that means is the property owners came in and said, that failing of the Corps of Engineers to maintain that infrastructure damaged my property, such that it resulted in a taking of the value of my property under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. At the trial court level, the property owners were awarded over $5 million in damages, and that is a scary proposition, that government now can be held liable such that it impacts people's property values, that they have to write checks. Of course, this case was appealed, and it was appealed on this notion of whether or not that impact, that flooding, can be temporary in nature. And so this particular case found that the U.S. government, the Corps of Engineers, could not be held liable for not acting with regard to the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Project. Now, contrast that with a case in the 5th District Court of Appeals here in Florida that has said that government can't be or can be held liable for not acting to maintain a road, Old A1A, in St. Johns County. So we have kind of a conflict of laws issue. It's the first time a state case has ever held that local government can be held liable for failing to act in a taking situation. So when a local government calls me and says, I got property owners squawking about elevating roads, am I going to be liable? Of course, it's a typical lawyer response, well, maybe. And, on one hand, you have this state case out here that's at the appellate level that's saying government inaction for failing to maintain infrastructure could hold you liable. But you've got a federal case out there in a very obscure court of claims jurisdiction that's saying no. So the answer is still unclear. And so the question is, who can be held liable for this? And can somebody be held liable for this type of damage? Borough of Harvey Cedars is an interesting case out of New Jersey post-Hurricane Sandy. Property owners fought against a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, poor Corps, and a local government project that was a dune restoration project. And with the project, the property owners would have had a protected life of 30 years. With the project, that protected life of their property would have extended out to 200 years. But you're in a beach community, and they didn't like the dune restoration project because it had an impact on their view. And of course, that's an important thing to property owners that obviously live in a coastal area. But what's interesting about this case is whether or not they could calculate the benefit of the dune restoration project in the calculation of the just valuation in the takings case. And the trial court said yes. The appellate court said no. And this was appealed to the the New Jersey Supreme Court that said, heck yeah, you have to include the benefits of that project in the calculation of just compensation. So that's kind of a signal to local governments that may be hesitant or fearful to deal with adaptation projects because they fear that they will get sued for impacting people's property values. And at the end of the day, the benefits of that project conceivably could be calculated into that damage reward. So when that $375,000 judgment was reversed, the property owners ultimately got $1. They got $1 after the benefits of that project were calculated in that just valuation. So again, a signal to local governments that, you know, maybe they should not be so fearful of actual adaptation projects, but it's something to consider in the cost of the project. So this is the Coran's property before the dune restoration project. This is the Coran's property after the dune restoration project. And this is Chris Christie overseeing the dune restoration project and his whole Beachgate scandal. But this project took place when he was still in office, interestingly. So moving on, nuisance. So when we typically think about nuisance, we think about a property owner that's got junk on their property that we don't like, or they're failing to maintain their property in such a way that's consistent with local code. But what about nuisance when there's water on your property? Nuisance can take that form. And so there have been many, many cases that have tried to use this theory of nuisance, but what they've tried to do is pin it on the fossil fuel industry. Kivalina was a group of islanders in Alaska that were trying to sue the fossil fuel industry for greenhouse gas emissions, but for you know what you're doing within this energy industry. Your greenhouse gas emissions are leading to global warming, climate change, sea level rise, and making our island go away. So you need to pay $400 million to relocate us. That case ended up essentially going nowhere, but there have been multiple cases that have tried to link that same cause to the fossil fuel industry. There have recently been a line of cases regarding local governments that are trying to pick up that terrain legally in terms of saying, hey, you know, but for you, fossil fuel industry, I wouldn't have to write an adaptation plan, tax my people, and pay a bunch for climate adaptation. I'm going to talk about those cases, but the hard thing about these cases is how do we attribute the greenhouse gas emissions that the fossil fuel industry is emanating, or the sale of petroleum product, with what we are all going to do when we get out of here is get in our car and drive home. And we are a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions also. And that is really hard for a court to determine what that causal link is. And in a tort liability case, that is absolutely necessary. So while we're having problems making that linkage in tort cases, takings cases for value of people's property seem to actually yield a little bit more success in terms of aggrieved property owners. So City of Oakland, this was a recent case. Multiple local governments sued the fossil fuel. I think there were 38 defendants in this case. June 28th, last year, there was a ruling essentially saying that, yeah, we recognize that the defendants are selling fossil fuel. Well, there are people buying fossil fuel to put in their cars. And can we really relate that to the cost of adaptation for the local government, especially when the local government didn't argue that the impacts were happening to them currently? They were speculative in nature, saying, I'm gonna have to pay for climate adaptation activities. And in this case, you know, it's really disappointing when you watch these cases and they find a wiggle way out of actually ruling on some of the substantive merits. You know, they said that this was premature. You have not actually demonstrated what those adaptation costs are. And you know what? We're the court. We're not going to tread on that policy and legislative and executive function of our three branches of local government. And that has been how the way a lot of courts have kind of wrangled out of these cases. Post-storm litigation. And there's nothing like a good storm to kind of shake things up legally. So post-Sandy, there was a very aggressive buyout program in New York and New Jersey. But there was a lot of litigation over the value that the government, various levels of government, were paying for those properties. And Harvey, a lot of plaintiffs have sued the Corps, of course, for operation of infrastructure. There was a big reservoir that failed and flooded a bunch of properties. Irma, it's a little early. Some of the early litigation I've seen has been more related to flood insurance and what flood insurance payouts have been. But the important thing is a lot of these lawsuits are still trying to pin a certain level of responsibility on a level of government for adverse impacts to property. And so there's this interesting little case out of Texas that I've been watching. And I think this is going to kind of shape things up. The last time I checked the docket, there wasn't really substantive briefing on the case yet. Mr. Ali is a lawyer in the Houston area who sued J.P. Morgan Chase because he bought a property outside the 100-year floodplain. His bank advised him he did not need flood insurance. Kind of what Jason was talking about, the disparity between people that only buy flood insurance because their mortgage lender makes them do it because they are within the 100-year floodplain, versus the statistic I've heard that 20% of the flood claims after Harvey were outside of the 100-year floodplain, people that had flood insurance anyway and got damaged. So the question is, what's so good about the 100-year line, especially when we're dealing with storms that have greater volume of precipitation? We're having storms at different times of the year. We're having storms that sit over us for 5 days and flood us incessantly. So what does this mean? And so his claim is that he received boneheaded advice from his mortgage lender. That's a technical term. Boneheaded advice from his mortgage insurer about whether or not he should get flood insurance. And he listened to that boneheaded advice, and now he's suing the bank. And so this little weird case, I think, has a lot of implications in terms of what it means to have that requirement that magically the 100-year flood line keeps us safe, especially when, as Jason pointed out, some of that mapping is not the greatest in the world. So this is one to continue to watch, because I think this kind of puts that national policy center stage, although maybe it won't, and maybe I'm the only one that geeks out on stuff like this, but I think it's a pretty important case. And then finally, Rhode Island v. Chevron was a very similar case to the Oakland one, where the local government was suing the fossil fuel industry, but this time they rectified the problem of saying that the damages were in the future. Rhode Island argues, and continues to argue, I believe, that the damage is now, and they're having to do adaptation now, and it is costly. So the other thing is, they not only brought federal claims, they've also brought state-level claims, and that's the important thing in terms of plaintiffs and how they're kind of prosecuting these claims in terms of choosing more favorable law of federal claims versus state claims. And Rhode Island had claims at both the federal level and the state level, which I think is what is continuing to keep the case alive. So I'm going to shift. Florida policy is rapidly evolving. We've had some executive orders under the Crist administration. We had some changes to comprehensive planning requirements, Chapter 163. We've had energy bills that have passed and failed. We've got a bill this session which essentially requires any state money that's going for a state building or being contributed to a local government building, they have to undergo a sea level rise and kind of resiliency analysis to be able to use that funding. Again, this notion of why do taxpayers have to be burdened with building something that's not resilient? So it'll be interesting. This is the second year that that bill has been offered by a Democrat in Miami, so we'll see where it goes. But there's other legislation this session trying to codify some of the recent Governor DeSantis executive orders regarding water, but in more particularity, the Office of Resilience that the state of Florida has had for the last couple of years, and kind of codifying a broader mission for that office. So it's early. We'll see what happens. Check back the first week of May. It could be a completely different dynamic. So what are local governments doing? One concept is adaptation action areas, where local governments are physically defining things on maps and saying, we're going to do things differently there. Ralph, I think you worked on Yankeetown.
Yep, Yankeetown.
Yep, adaptation action areas. Now, Yankeetown took a unique approach where their priority was focusing on natural areas, I believe, and the resiliency of natural areas and the function of those natural areas to protect us from damage of storm surge and sea level rise and that type of thing. And I like to use Yankeetown to kind of contrast the differences. The law is very broad. It does not prescribe what has to be in an adaptation action area. Other local governments are taking a very infrastructure-based approach. The city of Fort Lauderdale has designated 38 different a combination of 38 projects in 19 different adaptation action areas, the purple areas there on the map, and said, these are our highest priority areas in terms of flooding and climate adaptation. So they've taken a very infrastructure, capital improvements-based approach versus natural systems. Well, it also depends on the local government that you're in. You know, Fort Lauderdale is essentially very urbanized and built out. They don't have a lot of natural land to protect. And what they've got has been bought by, you know, the local government and is already protected in some form and is going to continue to function in that way in perpetuity. But in other areas that maybe have more opportunity, more green infrastructure solutions, nature-based solutions are probably a smart thing to prioritize in adaptation action areas. So it's very flexible, but it's a very good tool for local governments to draw a line on a map and say, we are going to do things differently in those particular vulnerable areas. Peril of flood legislation was passed in 2015. It requires these 6 elements to be included in comprehensive plans. Now, it's not retroactive. It doesn't say you have to go and rewrite your comp plan yesterday or today. It usually what happens is when the local government comes in for their, you know, once every 7-year kind of compliance review, they have to bring their comprehensive plan current with state law. And at that point, the Department of Economic Opportunity is probably going to write you a letter if you didn't address this stuff and say, hey, what about your peril flood amendments? You've got to include this stuff if you've got a coastal element of your comprehensive plan. Now, I've seen what I would call wide-ranging compliance with the law in terms of what Department of Economic Opportunity is looking for. Is anybody from DEO here? Okay, good. They don't know what they're looking for, to be honest with you. I have seen some local governments that have literally like copied and pasted the law and said, hey, we did our peril flood amendments. And I've seen other local governments that have gone really aggressive. Like the local leadership and the staff have used this as a tool to kind of express to the public that they're very serious about taking on climate change and adaptation issues, and by God, they're going to put it in their comp plan, and they're going to require different development regulations and engineering solutions, and they are going to deal with this. And I'm going to talk about one of those local governments in a minute. So what's happening around the state? You know, the West Coast has kind of joined together, parts of the West Coast have joined together in the local area to kind of take on a regional initiative of climate change, kind of led by the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. Broward County has done a bunch of enhanced modeling. They've also passed and adopted new groundwater regulations that require retention on site for development and redevelopment that doesn't only look for the next 25 years. It makes you look at adopted sea level rise maps and say, hey, you're going to have to deal with the fact that your groundwater capacity is diminishing, and you're going to need to show us that you're going to be able to retain your stormwater based on that. Fort Lauderdale, I talked about adaptation action areas. St. Augustine has got some unique issues with historic structures. And how do you deal with a historic structure that has been designated on the National Register, but you need to do some level of adaptation to it in very antiquated infrastructure? The Keeping History Above Water, which is a National Historic Preservation Conference, is in St. Augustine this year in May, so that's interesting. And many, many cities and counties across Florida are developing sustainability, climate adaptation, or resiliency plans. And so what I've seen are local governments coming in on this whole spectrum in terms of how they're dealing with this. You know, some are kicking and screaming and saying, we got to write that stuff into our comp plan now, so let's go ahead and do that. Some are saying, you know what, we are going to really integrate this into all elements of our comp plan, not just what we're required to do in coastal management, but maybe we're going to deal with it in conservation or the infrastructure elements. And then some are saying, it's high time we actually look at our land development regulations through freeboard ordinances or other requirements that require us to build higher. Let's not spend good money over bad in terms of land acquisition or environmentally sensitive lands. And then what I call the big enchilada is how do we manage expectations with infrastructure and level of service? And that's something Jason and I have been working on in Satellite Beach, but also upcoming in Monroe County. Delray Beach is one of those local governments. My office is in Delray Beach, interestingly. And they called me and said, look, we need some help with our comp plan. We want to bring it into compliance with these new peril of flood amendments. But we've done all this recent stuff. We've collected all of this really great data. They did a seawall height analysis and looked at all of their stormwater. Yeah, Jason's like, what? And I'm like, yeah. They looked at all their stormwater outfalls along the intercoastal. They got data. They know where they are. They measured the invert elevations. They've done a big report on this. They have also updated their stormwater master plan to account for future sea level rise risk. On February 12th, they briefed their commission and said, hey, at first blush, we think adaptation by 2050 is going to cost $389 million. And that was a big number. And the commission said, we need a longer workshop on this. And so they have really, what they did was their approach was obviously to come into compliance with the new peril of flood legislation, but they also have expanded the conservation element of their comprehensive plan to include resiliency and sustainability. We call it the CSR element now. Their transportation element is now called mobility. They have an economic prosperity element, a healthy communities element. And so this local government is one I can tell you because I live there, and it wasn't just me. They came to me to help them do this. They already had the vision of where they wanted to go and all of this good data that they had been developing. Monroe County is another case study. Jason talked a little bit about Monroe County. They have an existing climate and sustainability plan. They did a pilot analysis in 2 communities to deal with road elevation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. We worked on a NOAA grant with them, identifying their stormwater structures and what the vulnerability is in the future to those. And they are in the process, they have just awarded an RFP and are negotiating a contract to do a county-wide roads and stormwater analysis. They're going to break down, they're going to do it, and they're going to say, what are we going to have to elevate when? What is that going to look like? How do we come up with a long-term capital budget? Now, of course, they don't own and manage US 1, the main corridor facility down there, but they do own and manage all of the other roads that come off of US 1 into the neighborhoods. So they are trying to figure out what that looks like. I think there are 300 miles of roads they own and manage. It's a lot. So they are a good case study in terms of saying we are not afraid to see what the price tag looks like. We know this is going to be big and technical. They've got a very good engineering team on board, and they are plowing forward to figure out what the overall picture and cost is going to be in the future. And this is one of the communities that was hit pretty bad in 2015 and 2016. That's a road, that's not a canal. The salt water comes in through the lowest point at the end of that stop sign and floods the entire community every king tide. And I know when it happens because I've become pretty good friends with a couple of people on that street, and they're like, Erin, it's happening again. When are they going to build the project? And they have just awarded design of these pilot projects that I'm going to talk about. So raising roads is not that easy. There are a lot of complicated things associated with it. You have to account for future sea level rise. You have to account for any water quality regulations that you have in place, which they have a lot of extensive water quality regulations in the Keys. You got to deal with adjacent properties. You got to deal with driveways. People are not happy when you come in and raise a road and there's a big step from their driveway up there. Like, how do you deal with that? They're going to have to deal with stormwater, whereas a lot of these roads were built before stormwater regulations were in place down there. They're uneven, they're on muck, and they have no stormwater. Well, you're not just going to be able to slap asphalt on there. You're going to have to put stormwater systems in those roads that did not exist before. And that's going to be expensive, and county staff is concerned about what that ongoing maintenance cost is going to be, because it's going to be for managing stormwater systems that they've never had to manage before. And so this project, the reason we did a pilot is to, what does this look like? What do we not know about road elevation on a mass scale, which is probably one of the only things that is going to be a solution in the Keys. The big looming question, and this has legal implications, is are they going to elevate everything? Are there roads where it just doesn't make sense to elevate because it's obligating the county to a level of maintenance, not upgrade, maintenance for that infrastructure that is just not financially feasible in the long term? And what happens if they decide that they're going to abandon those roads or only maintain it to a certain level of service? Are those people going to get PO'd and sue the local government and say, you are adversely impacting my property value? And so that's how this all kind of ties together in terms of the engineering, the science, the policy, the litigation, and it is complicated. So what we did was we came up with a road standard. We said we're going to start with the actual elevation of the road. We're going to say, a great target is let's not exceed 7 days of flooding in terms of what we predict. For sea level rise, accounting for the next 25 years of sea level rise, because that's the useful life of a road project, and what elevation do we have to get to avoid those impacts? And so that accounts for differing elevations across the community. It may also account for different levels of financial responsibility for adaptation, because some areas of a community may need to pay, some areas of a community may not. And how do you normalize that? So these parts of the equation change, but the sea level rise estimates do not change. And so this is what they're looking at in terms of initial cost for these two pilot projects. The one neighborhood had to be elevated 6 inches, and the other neighborhood in Big Pine had to be elevated approximately 12 inches. And so I'm happy to report that they adopted that interim design calculation that I just showed you. They have now appropriated the money. They've awarded to a design team. They are in permitting. They should be in construction in a year. Now, that's going to make those people happy, but it's also going to give them a preview of all of the things we don't know about road elevation. The reason we picked Big Pine is because it's sensitive habitat to the key deer, and we figured if we could build something there, we could build it anywhere in the Keys, because that's going to be tough to get through the regulatory process there. I talked about Tampa Bay. Jason talked a little bit about what's going on in East Central Florida with Satellite Beach, but there is a larger initiative with the counties over there. The South Florida Regional Planning Council has been at it in terms of assistance they're providing local governments. And Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council, actually Jim Beaver, he has done a lot of the real pioneer work on this in terms of adaptation planning. through Punta Gorda and Lee County and some of those studies. I mean, he was one of the first that was really writing out what the potential impacts are and what a plan of attack is. And a lot of us, kind of forget that he was kind of one of the early movers and shakers in this. And a lot of these local government planning efforts are kind of premised on some of the stuff that started right in this region. So I'm about to wind up in terms of time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the public trust doctrine. Public trust doctrine is a principle that says government has to be responsible and hold certain resources in the public trust for future generations. And so there have been groups of youth plaintiffs across the country that have said, because the federal or a state government is not protecting against climate change in terms of regulating fossil fuel emissions, in terms of promoting renewable energy use, you are jeopardizing my right to a functional and sustainable atmosphere. And that air is part of the bundle of rights within the public trust doctrine. The climate is part of that bundle of rights. Marine resources are part of that bundle of rights. So it all started with a federal case called Juliana, and if you Google it, you will just see so much press on this case. Obviously, the federal government hates this case. These youth plaintiffs have come from multiple states, and they are suing the U.S. government, Department of Energy, EPA. The interesting thing about this case is it is still surviving in the courts out in Oregon. And there have been some very interesting gyrations and updates on the case. And so this is moving. It's in a pretty liberal circuit, the Ninth Circuit out there. But there is a very good judge out there knowing that this case is eventually going to be appealed. There is very specific discovery. And if you're not a lawyer, discovery is expert witnesses, reports, requests to produce, meaning we're going to look at all your documents, we're going to take depositions. There have been many nationally renowned climate scientists that have written testimony, many friend of the court amicus briefs that have been filed in this. And there have been a lot of very interesting issue-specific appeals at different points in the process. Like, we're going to appeal one issue and we're going to stop this thing from going to trial until we can resolve this particular issue. The most recent of those was resolved earlier this year, and that the trial court was supposed to be putting together an actual trial date. The attorneys in this case are a not-for-profit organization called Our Children's Trust, and other local and nationally renowned attorneys that are really trying to make some law here in terms of how we interpret the public trust doctrine. And so when all of the legal experts say, you know what, this is going to be the death knell of this case, this interlocutory appeal or this particular issue, it's going down. The poor case remains on life support, and it is still going strong, and I shouldn't say life support, it's still going pretty strong, and it'll be interesting to see if this case ever makes it to trial, and I think that is number one, the federal government's goal right now is to prevent this from going to trial. Reynolds v. Florida is a shoot-off of this case with regard to the state of Florida. There is a group of youth plaintiffs from all over the state, and those youth plaintiffs have sued under a Florida constitutional provision, which is tantamount to our public trust doctrine. Delaney Reynolds is a well-known youth climate activist. She's a University of Miami student down in Miami. And a lot of the claims in this case relate to the Florida Keys and the coral reef and the impact that's happening in the National Marine Sanctuary, ocean acidification issues, impacts to seagrass, sea life. And because that is such a unique feature of our environment in Florida, what the youth plaintiffs are seeking, they don't seek money damages in cases like this. They want action. And so they are seeking a statewide greenhouse gas inventory that will hopefully promote a shift in our philosophy in terms of how we use fuel, how we buy electricity, and hopefully shift to a more renewable, diversified energy mix. And what they would also like is a remedial plan. Get that data, and how do we remedy this situation within the extension of the public trust doctrine to a safe climate and a safe atmosphere. Motions to dismiss were filed in the case by the new administration. And so the shift in administration is going to be very interesting. This was set for trial in October. A week before the trial was supposed to commence, the judge in that case recused himself, never disclosing the reason for recusal, which is interesting. There's a new judge in the case. All of the plaintiffs have filed a motion to dismiss. A response was filed last week. And there have been settlement discussions. There have also been just all kinds of discussions about this case with the new administration and where it's going to go. But we'll see if this one ends up in trial also. And here are the youth plaintiffs. The kid second over from your right, Levi Draheim, he lives in the Satellite Beach area over on the central eastern coast of Florida. He is also a plaintiff in the national case. So if you're interested in more reading, I published an article in the Florida Bar Journal with an overview of everything that I've talked about today. I think it was the first time anybody's published a climate article in the Florida Bar Journal. And periodically, there's an environmental and land use law section of the bar. I would say annually, myself and Thomas Rupert, we do an update on all the law and planning related to climate change and sea level rise. And I will stop there. Questions? We have 5 minutes for any questions. Jennifer Hecker. Well, my scope of work with Lee County is pretty specific on water resource issues and Lake Okeechobee discharges, but that said, Jim Beaver did a lot of very early work with Lee County and the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council. They were one of the earliest to do an initial vulnerability assessment. So I have not looked in terms of where they are now in terms of vulnerability and climate change and sea level rise planning, but I know that they were one of the first movers in this. I also know, because I was involved in this project, they did a sustainability plan and looked at the energy use. I think they did a greenhouse gas inventory. They went through a sustainability evaluation called STAR, Sustainability Tools for Assessing and Rating Communities. And so I'm not sure how they are utilizing that plan at this point, but they did have some good data, and they were one of the first movers on these issues. Ralph.
Have we heard anything from Governor DeSantis' office about how they may address climate change, maybe through DEO or through the
Yeah, I mean, they were part of the climate change issue was part of the big executive order that the governor issued within a couple of days of coming into office. I would call it the water order. And it dealt a lot with water quality, the idea that they were going to put together like a red tide, blue-green algae task force. He also talked about the establishment of an Office of Resilience, where there had been an Office of Resilience in DEP, but for about 2 years, headed by Whitney Gray. But that office, the function of that office has largely been to get appropriations and move money down to local governments in the form of grants from $25,000 to $75,000 to do climate planning. The question is, what is the new vision of that office? My understanding is it's going to expand to resilience beyond just resilient coastlines. So that would be good because it would capture inland cities as well that are dealing with precipitation or downstream outfall issues, that type of thing. The other thing about that executive order was that the state is going to hire a chief science officer. And I think that is a really, really good sign that we're not going to hear the, I'm not a scientist, I don't know, kind of response, but there is going to be an individual that is going to be responsible for looking at that science. I don't know what level of staffing that person is going to have, but I think that they are actively trying to hire that person quickly. I like the fact that climate, the science officer, reconfiguring or extending the Office of Resilience was included in that holistic water order, because to me it signifies that the administration gets the link between red tide events, blue-green algae, the health of Lake Okeechobee, the health of our offshore systems, and the fact that that is jeopardized by climate change. Like, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I'm hoping that that linkage is apparent to this administration, where it hasn't been apparent in the past. Now, you raise a very important question, which I have not seen pronounced policy from this administration on, which is what are we going to do with growth management in this state? This is an issue we've talked about. Richard and I were talking about it the other week. We've seen the water piece, the water quality piece, the LACO piece, beating on the Corps of Engineers, reconfiguring of the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board. We all know that. But the question is, are we going to reconfigure the Department of Economic Opportunity again? Are we going to take the focus, continue to focus on the economy, or also now focus back on nuts and bolts growth management and planning and, 30 years of established case law on growth management and coastal high hazard areas and disaster planning and planning ahead and not putting the same schlock in harm's way that we've put in the past. I'm unclear. And nobody's running a big growth management bill this year. It's like every 4 or 5 years somebody says, I'm going to overhaul Chapter 163. And we're like, again. And so nobody's running with that. So that signals to me that maybe this administration isn't there yet, and maybe it's going to take them a year to better figure out what they want to see from a growth management perspective, and maybe we'll see overhaul legislation next year that is factoring some of these things into it. So I don't want to beat on them for not having an agenda yet for growth management. I'm kind of an optimistic person that maybe they think it's a really important issue, and they're trying to flesh that out before they come up with a comprehensive set of reforms. Anybody else? One more.
On the question of growth management, how important is high-rise as a solution versus planned communities and on-the-ground development? How significant is high-rise as a solution?
I think it depends on the area that you're talking about. In my mind, density is always a context issue. You would not want to promote a bunch of high-rise buildings in an environment like this, where it's low density. What you would want to do is you would want to promote sound building practices and possibly elevation of structures and resilient construction. There may be some seawall issues with canals and that type of thing. But at the end of the day, I'm never one to say that high-rise construction, even well done high-rise construction, is the solution anywhere. It's context specific. I think it really doesn't matter in a place like Miami Beach, where you already have that high level of density. So the question is redevelopment. It's not new construction. And of course, you're going to continue that level of density, or else the property is not economically viable to construct. But the things that they're going to be looking at are parking underneath, stormwater management. How are they going to connect to infrastructure that's being retooled in a place like Miami Beach? I think those are the challenges. But obviously, it's a piece of the equation, but it's got to be context specific in my mind. That's it. Great, thank you.